Good afternoon. How'd everyone enjoy that lunch? Very nice. So excited to have you. Again, we have a few more panels going on today. I'm very excited about this next panel. To lead this next panel is a key partner of Florida International University. Many of you already know that over the past year, FIU and the Atlantic Council signed a strategic partnership that has us working together to spread knowledge and actionable recommendations on security in the Western Hemisphere. So extremely proud to have co-hosted and partner with the Atlantic Council for the 11th anniversary of the Hemispheric Security Conference. And here to facilitate this next panel is an old friend. Where is he? There he is. So Jason Marczak is the Senior Director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin American and Caribbean Center and Vice President at the Atlantic Council. Very few people know the region better than Jason, so excited to bring him to the stage for this next great discussion. So please join me in welcoming Jason Marczak.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much, Randy. Randy actually missed one of the most important parts of my bio relevant for this conference is that I'm also a Panther. And so pleased to be an adjunct here at the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center here at FIU. I want to go ahead and also invite up our panelists. I think we'll go ahead and do that. So before we'll have an opening speaker, but first I'll invite Erik Bethel and Carlos Pimentel and Carlene Willis and Jorge Salcedo to come up to the stage and take your respective seats here. Save us a little bit of time. This panel is going to examine how procurement systems and governance frameworks for critical and dual-use infrastructure, particularly we're going to look at ports and strategic transport corridors and how they can become vectors for security risk, corruption, and foreign influence, and what it takes to close those gaps. Ports and transport corridors are not just economic assets, they're also strategic terrain. Who controls them, who builds them, and who maintains them carries, of course, profound security implications. And across the Western Hemisphere, we are seeing a convergence of threats. Transnational criminal organizations exploiting infrastructure for illicit flows, and we heard from Joseph Umeyer earlier, and also foreign actors seeking influence through opaque investment and equipment supply chains. Here, the United States has a direct national security interest in what happens at key ports in Latin America and the Caribbean. And today's speakers are going to represent multilateral, investment, procurement, operational, and manufacturing perspectives, which will all help us to map some of the vulnerabilities and what's going to take to close them. So first, to frame today's conversation, I'm pleased to invite to the podium Leah Giménez. Leah is a senior advisor to the president of CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean. She has served as Minister of Finance of Paraguay, Secretary General and Chief of Cabinet of the Presidency of the Republic of Paraguay, among her many other roles. From CAF's vantage point, financing infrastructure investment across the hemisphere, she is uniquely positioned to frame some of these regional stakes. And I'll also say that Leah and the CAF is also a fantastic partner of the Atlantic Council in our work focused on countering criminal organizations, especially with respect to their role in impeding legitimate economic growth. So please join me first in welcoming Leah Giménez to the podium to frame this conversation.
Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues, representatives of government and international organizations, members of the private sector, and partners from across the hemisphere. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today. It is a pleasure to be here at the Florida International University with the Atlantic Council and all the institutions contributing to this important conversation. Ports, roads, logistic corridors, energy systems, financial platforms, and digital networks are the backbone of development. They connect producers to markets, reduce costs, attract investment, and integrate countries into regional and global value chains. But they are also at the center of one of the region's most urgent development challenges, the convergence between economic activity, organized crime, and institutional vulnerability. This convergence creates an uneven playing field. Unlike lawful businesses, illegal actors benefit directly and disproportionately from institutional weaknesses. Where controls are fragmented, where data systems do not speak to each other, where procurement is vulnerable, where customs, police, prosecutors, port authorities, and financial intelligence units operate in silos, criminal networks gain advantage. They can move faster, adapt more easily, exploit gaps to their benefit, and run those weaknesses into huge profits, protection, and market power. Meanwhile, lawful agents face higher costs, delays, extortion, insecurity, and reputational risks. This is a critical challenge. We are facing a diversified, highly organized, highly profitable, and deeply networked criminal economy that uses our strategic assets more aggressively than many lawful actors can, and that thrives precisely where institutions are weakest. As a result, the Americas registered levels of transnational organized criminal activity above the global average. The data are sobering. According to UNODC, organized crime and gangs are linked to roughly 50% of homicides in the Americas, more than twice the global average. The region also has a particularly lethal combination of violence and firearms. Around 67% of homicides in the Americas are committed with firearms, compared with much lower shares in Europe and Asia. All this matters for development because violence is not only a security problem, it is a tax on growth. It raises the cost of doing business, disrupts trade, weakens investors' confidence, diverts public resources, and erodes trust in institutions. The direct cost of crime and violence in Latin America and the Caribbean is estimated to be around 3.5% of GDP. That is comparable to what many countries in the region spend on major social or infrastructure priorities. The cocaine market illustrates the scale of the challenge. UNODC reports that in 2023, we reached a record level of coca cultivation and cocaine production, with an estimated 377,000 hectares under cultivation and 3,708 tons of pure cocaine produced globally. This is not a marginal activity. It is a transnational and transcontinental business of enormous scale. And to connect supply with demand, criminal organizations depend on ports, roads, warehouses, customs systems, maritime routes, and financial networks. That is why areas around strategic infrastructure are increasingly targeted and exposed to violence, extortion, corruption, and institutional pressure. This creates a painful paradox for Latin America and the Caribbean. The region has the resources to lead the development and contribute significantly to food security and the green transition, with agriculture, energy, biodiversity, critical minerals, logistics, tourism, creative industries. But it continues to face lackluster growth while ranking at the top in 12 out of 15 criminal markets. And the cause is not only economic. Our young people, who should be at the center of innovation, productivity, and democratic renewal, are too often being recruited, threatened, or victimized by criminal economies. Globally, critical infrastructure is understood as a matter of national security, strategic autonomy, and defense. Latin America and the Caribbean must apply the same lens to all its critical infrastructure. The question is not only who finances, who builds, or who operates these assets. It is also who controls the flow that moves through them, who benefits from those flows, and whether the state has the capacity to govern them. For CAF, this means security can no longer be treated as a separate from development. If we finance infrastructure without understanding the criminal risks around it, we might unintentionally strengthen the very network that undermine development. But if we integrate security, governance, transparency, and institutional resilience into infrastructure planning, procurement, and operations, we can protect assets, strengthen markets, and restore state presence. The next generation of infrastructure investment must include a security calculus from the beginning, not as an afterthought, but at the design stage. This is a powerful way to begin to shift the advantage back toward lawful actors. We face an important challenge, but also a great opportunity for hemispheric integration. Let us work on this together. Thank you.
Leah, thank you so much for those important framing comments. I think set the stage for the rest of this conversation. A couple key points. The tax on growth, the cost is not just economic, and that also security calculus must start at the design steps as well. So all things we'll talk about as part of this panel, where we're going to now focus more on I'll focus on the operational, the policy, the manufacturing realities, because the gap between the strategic diagnosis and what actually happens at the contracting table or at the port gate or on the water, that's where this conversation can really surface actionable ideas moving forward. So I'm going to now go ahead and introduce our four speakers joining us today. To my immediate left here is Jorge Salcedo, the president of IMPSA. IMPSA is headquartered here in Miami with a commercial office in Buenos Aires, production plant in Houston, and also technology development center in Mendoza. It's also a global leader in the energy and port crane sector with deep project execution experience across the region. And I'll also say, as we're having this panel, a front row seat to what procurement competition actually looks like when you're a regional manufacturer competing against suppliers with state-backed financing. This is an area also of our work with IMPSA. So Jorge, great to have you here on the panel today. Next to Jorge, joined by Carlos Pimentel. Carlos is General Director of the Dominican Republic's General Directorate of Public Procurement and the champion also of a landmark resolution establishing integrity and security standards in national security contracting, along with a joint action protocol between the office he leads and the National Intelligence Directorate, which we will speak about as part of this panel today. Next to Carlos is Erik Bethel. Erik has looked at maritime infrastructure, I would say, Erik, from nearly pretty much every angle. He's done this as a Senate-confirmed U.S. representative to the World Bank. He's done this whether it's nominated as ambassador to Panama, co-founder Mare Liberum, which is a maritime technology fund with $150 million in Pentagon funding, and also sits on the board of Windward, which is a maritime AI company. Spent years in Shanghai running Sino Latin capital. So a real expert insider's view on the issues we'll talk about today. And next to Erik is Carleen Willis. Carleen is the Director for Government and Community Affairs at Tropical Shipping. Now, Tropical, which we've worked with a lot over the years, is I'll say the premier cargo and freight shipper in the Caribbean, over 60 years of experience. You're headquartered near the port of Palm Beach, about an hour and a half, depending on traffic, up 95. Your vessels, your terminals, and your cargo move through some of the hemisphere's most exposed maritime corridors. I'll also say this, part of our work, the Atlantic Council's work with Tropical, to accelerate more U.S. investment into Caribbean ports. We held back in February the inaugural U.S. Caribbean Maritime and Ports Forum here in Miami Beach alongside FIU, and we're joined by Governor DeSantis to give some comments as part of that conversation. So opening, and I'm gonna start with you, Erik. Leah described some of the structural problems and with a high degree of precision. But we're going to start to look at kind of diagnosing the gap, and specifically we'll be focusing on port infrastructure, in particular on the vulnerabilities as part of this panel. What do you see insofar as the gaps between the rules that exist and the risks that persist, especially from your perspective with regard to the mitigating foreign influence?
All right. Let me begin by just describing what it is that we do. So we have a fund, and we invest at the intersection of critical technologies and maritime. Obviously, ports play a major role. When you think about port security, you think maybe we need security guards and you need a gate, and maybe a key card so that you can get in and out. But the reality is the ZPMC cranes that you have, which are like China has, this is a Chinese company, it has like an 80% global market share. They have cameras on them. They're telling Beijing what exactly is going into and out of your port. There's a Chinese company called NukeTech, China NukeTech, that does all the scanning equipment, and they see what's inside of your containers. Again, all of that's being harvested. You've got Hikvision cameras in your ports. So you have a whole world of technology that is hidden in plain sight, and you think it's benign, but it actually isn't. So to be charitable, let's assume that all of that equipment is, it's not designed to be malicious, but it's harvesting all of your economic data and it's sending it one way. So clearly you have to start thinking about, from a policy standpoint, which was your question, how do you address things like this that are hidden in plain sight? And to all of you in the audience that run ports, just think about another company, China Log Inc. or Log Inc. It's a free Chinese software company that does port optimization. It helps you know what ships are coming in, what's leaving, is there demurrage in your yard. All of this is Chinese. And so you need to think to yourself, when something is free, maybe I'm the mark, right? So just keep that in mind.
Thanks, Erik. We'll go back to those points throughout the panel. Picking up on, and I'm going to go to you next, Carlos, but picking up, and also for those, Carlos will speak in Spanish, so if anyone wants, you should have translation if you need it. When you look at the gaps that exist between the rules and the rules that exist and the risks, Erik talked about China. You've done some work specifically with regard to kind of getting governments more involved insofar as addressing those challenges from a criminal perspective. Share a little bit more on kind of how you see the role of government and specifically how you've been able to address that from the Dominican Republic insofar as criminal enterprises and reducing their influence and strategic infrastructure.
Sí. Bueno, lo primero a señalar es que las contrataciones públicas han pasado de ser un mero trámite administrativo a una de las políticas más estratégicas de cualquier Estado. Primero, por los volúmenes de recursos, por el flujo, se estima un 30 o un 32% del presupuesto, o un 15-20% de Producto Interno Bruto de algunos países, y está asociada a riesgos que atentan contra la seguridad nacional de cualquier país. Primero, la corrupción en las contrataciones públicas. Segundo, es una vía de entrada de lavado de activos. Y un elemento importante que ha sido poco debatido y me parece muy importante traerlo a este escenario, son las incidencias geopolíticas en las contrataciones. A veces pensamos que las contrataciones solamente tienen intereses económicos, pero hay intereses geopolíticos. Por eso, las contrataciones públicas tienen que ser vistas obligatoriamente desde una perspectiva integral del Estado y una mirada importante vinculada a la seguridad nacional y a la seguridad hemisférica. Digo esto porque ya no es suficiente que una agencia de contrataciones de cualquier país por sí sola pueda trazar políticas, normas que puedan garantizar no solamente que el Estado adquiera lo que necesite, de la calidad que lo necesite y al precio más justo, sino qué está comprando el Estado y a quién le está comprando el Estado. Y dentro de esas preguntas, prestar atención a tres sectores fundamentales. Primero, infraestructura crítica como energía, telecomunicaciones, tema de agua potable, transportes colectivos. Segundo elemento, muy importante a prestar atención, las adquisiciones de medicamentos e insumos médicos. Y el tercer elemento está vinculado a la adquisición de tecnología. La adquisición de tecnología en todas las operaciones del Estado es de alto riesgo y por eso cada vez más se debe prestar atención con quién contratamos. No es suficiente un procedimiento, un precio, un requerimiento, sino que es necesario trasladar aquella vieja premisa de quienes investigan delitos financieros, de conoce tu cliente. Hoy día tenemos que decir conoce tu proveedor. Y no es suficiente una debida diligencia simple, sino que es necesario la debida diligencia ampliada. Y por eso los entes del Estado, garantes de la seguridad, de la inteligencia, de la protección de los delitos cibernéticos, o en el caso de la República Dominicana, que hemos creado recientemente el Instituto Criptográfico Nacional, juegan un rol fundamental. Hace 2 semanas, la Dirección General de Contrataciones Públicas de la República Dominicana firma un acuerdo, un protocolo con la Dirección Nacional de Investigaciones, con el Centro de Ciberseguridad y con el Instituto Criptográfico Nacional, para poder atender la infraestructura crítica que representa el sistema electrónico de contrataciones.
Y Carlos, vamos a hablar un poco más detalles sobre este protocolo en algunos minutos, porque me parece tan grave para compartir con toda la audiencia. Pero quisiera I'll continue with this first line of question. We'll go back to describing in more detail the protocol. I think what we've heard so far from Erik and from Carlos is the importance of technology, the importance of also, Carlos mentioned being integral and the way that we approach procurement, and the risk in knowing your provider. And Jorge, I want to go to you. IMPSA, as I mentioned, fundamental in this business, specifically and work around cranes. If you could speak from a business person's perspective, as president of IMPSA, what you see in some of the gaps that exist between the rules and the risks, and specifically from all the challenges that we see with infrastructure, whether it's the investment screening, security standards, and other things, and how you're seeing that kind of affect day-to-day operations.
Thank you, Jason, for the opportunity. I also want to thank the TAEDA Foundation and Mr. Mario Montoto for the invitation, and Atlantic Council for having me in this panel. I think you bring a very important point. I mean, from our standpoint at IMPSA, we are, one of the reasons why we acquired a company was based on the market of STS cranes. You know, as Erik pointed rightly, the CPMC is the main provider of STS cranes in the world and also in the United States. I can give you a history with IMPSA. It's very unique in the sense that in the 90s, IMPSA had a location, a facility in Malaysia where we were building STS cranes, and we have sold around 350 STS cranes around the world. One of our subcontractors back in the 90s was CPMC, and they were in charge of basically erecting the crane in some of our projects.
Actually, Jorge, you want to explain the acronyms for those who might not?
Yeah, so CPMC is, the STS cranes is the ship-to-shore cranes, or the gantry cranes. And CPMC is a Chinese company that builds Chinese cranes around the world, and they sell it. They were one of our subcontractors back in the 90s, and they stole our engineering. And the reason why CPMC grew up the way that they grew up, it was based on engineering that was stolen from us. Now we are expecting new legislation in the U.S., and we're seeing some steps taken in that direction. There are 2 executive orders that are meant to prohibit the Chinese cranes in the market. So it's a great opportunity for us, you know, in terms of from the business perspective, which is because there's only a few non-Chinese manufacturers of gantry cranes and STS cranes. And we are thinking about starting a facility here in Miami-Dade County to assemble STS cranes for the East Coast, and also to start selling around, you know, the allied countries. And one of the things that it's important from what Erik mentioned before is that these Chinese cranes are transmitting information about trade, and they also have the capacity to be controlled remotely and from Beijing. And this is not only a policy that should be focused in the U.S. territory, it should be focused also in allied countries like the Dominican Republic or Panama, where we receive significant amounts of trade. I mean, the cranes, I mean, if we change all of our cranes to be non-Chinese or more secure, but the port of origin has cranes that are controlled by the Chinese, we are not accomplishing the goal of having a more secure ports. So as I said, from the business perspective, I think it's a great opportunity. However, we're really looking to see a more concrete steps in terms of legislation so we can actually compete, because the price of the Chinese cranes are almost 40% of the price of manufacturing a crane under the BABA standards, the Build American by American standards. I mean, that takes our crane to almost 200% of what they can manufacture one. So, I mean, we're really looking forward to more concrete legislation in that sense.
And Jorge, the story that you just shared, the story of what IMPSA has had IMPSA has to go through, I think that's something that needs to be broadly shared, and just the risk that exists for U.S. companies and how China's been able to take advantage of that technology. I want to go to Carleen, because Carleen, we've done so much work together with tropical shipping, looking specifically at the importance of greater U.S. investment and Caribbean, specifically Caribbean port infrastructure. And so important tropical as a premier shipper for the Caribbean. When you look at as well at the structural challenges that exist from a shipping company perspective, what do you see insofar as the biggest gaps between the rules that exist as well as the risks that persist, whether it's for tropical or whether it's actually for tropical's customers as well?
Yeah, thank you for that great question, and thank you for being on this panel. I would say that there's probably, from the ship operator side, 3 things that we're seeing. That's legislation, because the shipping industry is one of the most heavy regulated industries. Then you're also saying, and this was mentioned, the technology solutions. And then finally, the capacity constraints that occur with operating in the Caribbean region, because that's the only region that we operate in. So just to talk about legislation, we operate in multi-jurisdictional territories. So, sovereign nations that each have their own legislations on security. And then you also are regulated on the international level at the International Maritime Organization on security as well. So one of the issues that you have, particularly operating in the Caribbean, is the implementation of the legislative frameworks that allow for proper port security. If you can ratify an agreement at the International Maritime Organization, but if you don't integrate that into your domestic legislation, it becomes a little bit of an operational problem for us. So we like to encourage the member states I call them member states, I used to be a member state. We like to encourage the countries that we work with to make sure that their legislation is up to date, and that's something that we do as tropical. Also, we talked about technology. When you're operating in the Caribbean region, some of the ports are still paper-based. And when we talk about issues of security, you want to know what is coming in and out of your port. So if you have a paper-based system, it makes it very difficult to track, what are the goods that are coming in. And it becomes an administrative burden for us as a shipping company to be able to answer certain questions, or to know, if you're looking through a stack of documents, to be able to report on what has come in and out of a port. That's it's a burden for us as well. And then finally, sometimes you're looking at capacity constraints at particular ports. So, I don't want to immediately say that, people are, and this might just be the optimist in me, that they're unwilling to do the right thing, or they're unwilling to implement security measures. You're just probably facing an issue where it's 3 guys at the port, and they don't have the capacity to really do the extent of what you can And we see that, for example, we operate out of the port of Palm Beach, which is a US port. And, you know, US Customs, Border and Customs, you know, high level of security, the legislative frameworks are there, you know, the capacity of the people, the technology is integrated. But as you move throughout the Caribbean region, you see, I'd say, a variability in the capacity to do some of those things. So as an operator, it does create a level of difficulty for us to have to be able to move through different legislative frameworks, different capacity constraints, and then different levels of technology that are available at each port.
That's really interesting, Carleen. And so I think as we're looking at some of the things that have been put on the table so far, right? And you're talking about the variability of legislative frameworks and capacity. So a company like Tropico, you're operating across the Caribbean, we have to navigate different legislative frameworks, we have to navigate different levels of capacity. And all of this, of course, are things that criminal groups are trying to take advantage of, right? The lack of clarity across different frameworks, paper-based systems as well. That breed themselves to corruption and other challenges and capacity issues. And we've also talked about the challenges with, as Jorge was mentioning as well, Chinese technology and monitoring, and Erik was mentioning as well, Chinese monitoring of what's coming in and out based on what they're seeing through cranes, the importance of how do we have more crane technology that's actually U.S. And allied produced, and as Carlos mentioned, the importance of, from a government perspective, really being able to connect the dots between different agencies. This is actually one reason why I'll give a little promotion here at the Atlantic Council. We've started all of our work on America's port security because we believe it's it's criminal groups. It's about more favorable investment in ports, about transparency, economic security, best practices, investment. And procurement that are so critical and is oftentimes underlooked, the importance of ports as part of our critical infrastructure. Erik, as you've looked at ports and maritime infrastructure from pretty much nearly every angle, when you look at the Western Hemisphere's port infrastructure today, where do you see the foreign influence most acute? We've talked about a few examples so far in the panel, maybe give in addition to that. And are markets and governments, do you think, moving fast enough, or what needs to be done to move faster to counter adverse foreign influence?
I'd like to echo what Carleen was mentioning. The paper-based systems are not just unique to the Caribbean. We also have them here in the United States. So when, let's assume I'm moving furniture from Miami to wherever, Jamaica, Tropical knows that the box was on the ship, and then they know when it got to Jamaica it was offloaded. But what happens before and what happens after, right? And so a lot of these are paper-based systems, and it's really hard to track. Nobody knows where anything is. So, we've been looking at companies that go in physically with people and take photos of the paper, bring it in, they scrape the internet for vessel traffic, and they have to go through all of these gyrations to make sure that that when your furniture was packed in Miami and it arrived in Jamaica, you know exactly where it is. So being able to track your stuff is almost impossible, even in the United States. There are a number of companies that are out there trying to solve the problem in lots of different ways in a sort of a patchwork method. But that's a huge challenge. I'll stop and then I'll pivot to something a little bit different, and that is finding vessels in the ocean. As I know we're in a Western Hemisphere focused event, but what's happening in Hormuz today is absolutely insane. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the AIS concept, AIS is every vessel has to have one, as my fellow panelists, I'm sure, undoubtedly know, certainly Tropical knows. The vessel basically was a means to keep your ships from colliding. Even sailboats have them. And it's a beacon, and it says, hi, I'm a sailboat, hi, I'm a tanker, I'm whatever. It's run out of London. The International Maritime Authority has oversight. What's happening in Hormuz is tankers, they pay their $2 million to the Iranians, and they leave, and they're like, oh no, there's the US Navy. So they turn their beacons off, which they can do because it's all self-reported. Then they go back in, And then they reconfigure the system and say, well, actually I left Abu Dhabi and, oh, I'm a Senegalese flagged vessel, I'm no longer a Liberian. And then they go out again, and our Navy doesn't know what to do. So all of these are called shadow vessels or dark tankers. They go by many names. And so that's a monumental problem that needs to be addressed. I can double click on that if you want, but in the interest of time, maybe I'll stop.
Can I just, quick follow-up? Going back to my question, how do governments moving faster? What needs to happen so that they can move faster to counter some of these threats?
I think something Carlos mentioned that was very spot on is technology. The use of technology is extremely important. There are so many technologies out there, ranging from cyber, as he mentioned. I'm pleased to hear that there's a crypto, están haciendo mucho en criptología, muy bien. So I'm glad to see all of that is taking place. But I think it's the embrace of technology that is going to sort of win the day.
Sounds that's excellent. And I want to go back to you, Carlos. I mentioned earlier you were starting to explain the Joint Action Protocol, and I want to give you some time to share that with the audience, because this is an important national resolution championed in the Dominican Republic that really establishes integrity and security standards in national security procurement. And something between the office that you lead, as well as I'm working closely with the National Intelligence Directorate. So if you could share a little bit about what does this framework do that previous procurement law did not do, and also why did you see it as so necessary to be able to move forward this Joint Action Protocol now, and maybe even do you see it as an example for other countries in the region?
Sí, bueno, creo que se ha señalado que cada vez más queremos usar menos papel, utilizar más tecnología, y es lo que va a permitir más automatización, más agilidad, más datos para tomar decisiones más oportunas, pero al mismo tiempo vamos asumiendo mayores riesgos. Todos los países de la región, las contrataciones de bienes, servicios o obras se realiza a través de sistemas electrónicos de contrataciones públicas. En el caso de la República Dominicana, hasta el 2020, el sistema electrónico de contrataciones era administrado por un tercero. Nosotros entendemos que los sistemas sensibles del Estado no pueden ser administrados por terceros, y mucho menos terceros que no sean proveedores confiables y que no sean de países confiables. Por eso asumimos como principio la soberanía tecnológica, y por eso el sistema electrónico de contratación de la República Dominicana es gestionado y administrado por el órgano rector de las contrataciones. Obviamente, el órgano rector no lo puede hacer solo, porque influyen distintos elementos que requieren la participación de otras agencias del Estado, como es la Dirección Nacional de Investigaciones, para apoyar en debidas diligencias reforzadas, para conocer con quiénes contratamos, sobre todo en los procesos de contrataciones vinculados a la seguridad nacional. Y toda contratación de infraestructura crítica de tecnología que sea para ser utilizada en puertos, aeropuertos o fronteras, son contrataciones sensibles, que no es suficiente cumplir un procedimiento, y mucho menos lo que señalaba Jorge, que el precio sea determinante. Por eso hemos insertado en el sistema de contratación de la República Dominicana como criterio el valor por dinero. Debemos extirpar para siempre la práctica, la cultura de que tenemos que comprar lo más barato. El Estado tiene que comprar lo que necesite, de la calidad que lo requiera, lo más confiable, lo que garantice mayor integridad y al precio más justo. Entonces, por eso las agencias de contrataciones tienen que contar con una mirada integral con otras agencias del Estado, como es el Centro de Ciberseguridad, para prever los ataques a una plataforma que interactúan 120,000 proveedores, 680 unidades de compra, y que tiene diario 600 procesos de contrataciones, dentro de los cuales hay procesos vinculados a la seguridad del Estado. No únicamente de la garantía de la plataforma, sino y sobre todo con quién contratamos. Y además, un tema muy importante es garantizar la seguridad jurídica de las transacciones que se dan en nuestras plataformas tecnológicas, y por eso el Instituto Criptológico que no hemos referido. Ahora, ¿qué es importante en todo esto? Que los estados deben definir de manera muy clara qué compran y qué no compran. Y para eso hay que pasar por procesos de fichas técnicas y hay que homologar bienes y servicios y tener la firmeza de establecer de manera clara con quién contratamos, con quién no contratamos, qué compramos y qué no compramos. Y ahí se genera un equilibrio que hay que buscarle los contrapesos entre lo que es la libre competencia y lo que son los aspectos vinculados a la seguridad o a la integridad de los estados y de las naciones. Entonces, este es un componente que genera otra mirada, que tiene otra visión, y de ahí la importancia de hacerlo acompañado de estas agencias y el protocolo que hemos establecido en la República Dominicana, pues nos lleva a poder tener mayores niveles de coordinación, de articulación, de intercambio, de interoperabilidad, de los flujos de información que generan las contrataciones públicas. Y para terminar, tener muy claro, los estados para funcionar tienen que contratar bienes, servicios y obras. Es la mayor actividad y es donde se vincula lo público y lo privado y donde hay más riesgo vinculado a la seguridad por los factores que inciden en estas contrataciones y sumado a esto en los últimos años aspectos vinculados a los contextos internacionales de la geopolítica.
Sí. Bueno, muchas gracias, Carlos. Me parece muy importante también podría ser como una lección para otros países en el Caribe de lo que podría hacer. It seems like it's a link between the Procurement Office, the National Intelligence Directorate, to be able to understand, know your customer, right? Know who you're working with, know who you're going to have a potential project with is so fundamental. Jorge, I want to go back to you and just drill down a little bit more because IMPSA does such important work on cranes and making sure that cranes are within kind of the allied interests and that it presents a liability not just for the countries themselves and for ports, but also for companies of just China having that access to what's coming in and out of ships, knowing exactly the cargo, and the real challenges with regard to producing more cranes that are controlled not by China, which is China so much dominates that market. How is IMPSA seeing kind of the future of kind of crane technology, and what are going to be what's going to be necessary to be able to displace some of the adverse foreign influence that we see currently in the market in cranes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the only advantage that we have in terms of competition is that our competition is just one company, which is CPMC. The rest of the STS ship-to-shore crane manufacturers are non-Chinese, and there's no reports of other companies like Mitsui Paseco, which is Japanese, and Kone Cranes, which is Finland, and Liebherr, which is German. I mean, none of those cranes have reported to have components that are transmitting information or that are in some way compromise the national security of the United States or any country. So the good thing is that we have one competition, one enemy we need to focus. One of the most critical issues that we have is that the CPMC, which is completely financed by the Chinese government, has a ship that actually, while they're transporting the crane, they're manufacturing the crane as they're delivering it. And I mean, for any STS manufacturer to have that type of equipment or transportation, it's impossible. I mean, it's a very large investment that you will never have the returns that you need. So I guess, what we're expecting is that the United States and the allied countries start taking the position as kind Carlos mentioned, that we're not going to buy the cheapest cranes. We're going to buy the ones that actually protect our national security. And the idea here is that we're willing to compete with other manufacturers. We can't compete with one that has such that has the subsidy of the Chinese government, and that makes it impossible for us to compete in terms of price. And I think that's where we need to focus. I've seen some developments from, for example, the DOT has created a program to finance that gap in price between the Chinese cranes and the non-Chinese cranes to ports that are willing to implement that policy of not buying Chinese cranes. I mean, that difference in price is being financed by DOT in order to protect the U.S. national security. But as I said before, I mean, we don't accomplish the real goal if it's only the United States that is taking this measure. It has to be taken by the allied countries and the countries that we're trading with.
Jorge, is it as simple as just swapping out Chinese technology with non-Chinese technology on cranes that already exist, or is it much more difficult?
No, it's more difficult because, I mean, the reports that we're seeing is not only electronic components that are transmitting information. I mean, they found elements that are not within the original design of the crane. They're actually metal mechanic components that have very small devices. They are very difficult to detect, and they're transmitting information. So, I mean, if you want to be completely safe, I mean, you need to have a process of fabrication that is completely supervised. Also, I mean, even some of the subcontractors and the technology providers like Siemens, I mean, the CPMC argue, oh, we're using Siemens, which is a secure, supplier of technology. But the problem is that the Siemens technology was sent completely to China, and it was sitting there for 6 months while the crane was being manufactured and then sent back to the United States. And then in that 6-month period, I mean, the Chinese could intervene the Siemens technology. So, I mean, we have to have some sort of a supervision of fabrication and reliability, and that's the reason why also the United States promoting the BABA cranes, the Build American, Buy American cranes with, full U.S. suppliers and U.S. manufacturing, and also with the allied contracts. I mean, we are an American company with facilities in Mendoza, in Argentina, and I mean, we have a very secure facility and willing to have a transparent way of manufacturing these cranes.
Thank you, Jorge. I want to go back to Carleen, and then I saw Erik, you nodding your head, so I'll go back. I'm sure you want to add to that point, but first let me go to Carleen, because Carleen Tropical, as you mentioned before, operates across the Caribbean basin. So from an operator's perspective, where do you see security frameworks that governments have built? Where do you see that holding up at the port level? Because you're seeing this at Tropical on frankly, a daily basis, right? And where also do you see some of those security frameworks falling short? You mentioned some of it before, but I'd like for you to have you drill down specifically on some of those ports you're seeing across the Caribbean.
Yeah, I think I would have to reframe that just a little bit in terms of, because when you're operating across the different governments, you expect a certain level of unpredictability and disjointed frameworks, and I don't want to particularly call out the ports that we.
Yeah, maybe from a macro perspective, what do you see rather than
I guess I'll say that when we're operating in let's say, for example, in like the U.S. islands, you'll have of course stronger frameworks, but as you get to the smaller ports, particularly in the Eastern Caribbean states, it's a little bit more, porous. So it's just something that we're particularly conscious of. And I wanted to touch on some ways, like I said, because of that unpredictability and because of that difference of framework, how we try to counter some of those things, and how what I've seen has been really helpful that I hope we can continue, especially with the U.S.'s turn towards the Western Hemisphere. And the first thing is, internally within Tropical, we invest in knowing the rules, so that we have an imports team and a customs team that knows the rules not only in the U.S., but invest in knowing it across the 32 locations that we operate in the region. And that's just internally for us to know, to protect our reputation as a business, to know the rules, to know the laws, and then encourage working with, for example, with members, with the CARICOM, with the Caribbean Memorandum of Understanding, with UNCTAD, with different frameworks to be able to, make sure that support member states in enforcing the rules. One thing that has been really also beneficial now is the capacity building with the U.S. On security. So partnering with the Department of Homeland Security and with Southern Command within the region to make sure that they have the legislative frameworks that allow for better security, and then that also train the port managers to understand what a high level of security looks like. Sometimes it's not necessarily that, like I said, there's an unwillingness, but maybe it's an expansion of the mind to understand what does a high secure or a secure port facility look like? And all of the things that have been mentioned on the panel in terms of countering influence from China in your port activities, how are you bringing that into the conversation so that countries are aware of what's happening at their port, because they might not even be thinking of it in the frameworks that we are. And then finally, and this is something that I think it's really good that we do with the Atlantic Council, is that we start talking about investments that pivot towards working with US companies and pivots towards how can we partner within the Caribbean to ensure that procurement happens with US companies, and I guess how do you expand that type of framework in mind, because I don't think in the past that has happened. A lot of the countries have looked for cheaper capital, easier capital, but now that we have this pivot towards working with the United States, how are we taking advantage of this moment to allow for the union of what needs to be done in a Caribbean port and a US-based company that can invest in that, and that's critical to the work that we do with you.
And it's a real challenge, and that we've been working on for quite some time with Tropical, is the fact that you just don't have U.S. investment coming into Caribbean ports, and so it's very difficult to be able to change the dynamic, whether it's foreign influence or whether it's better legislation. When the U.S. Financial firms just don't see the interest or the appetite to be able to invest in Caribbean ports. I think in the 5 minutes we have left, Leah also framed this conversation as well. We've been talking a lot about foreign influence. We've been talking about China, whether it's on cranes or ports. Also, with Carlos, we've also been talking about the importance of linking with intelligence, procurement, knowing your customer as well, better technology, reducing paper trails as well. But Leah also framed the importance of safety on our infrastructure insofar as kind of criminal groups, and the growth of criminal groups is also being a tax on growth, and that the cost is not just economic. So I'd like to just go around round robin through the panel here. Maybe start with you, Jorge. When you're looking at port infrastructure writ large, what would be the one thing that you'd want people to walk out of this conversation to know and to be able to continue to move forward with regard to a concern that you're seeing from IMPSA, where you think that there is a real opportunity for change, in addition to maybe some of the legislation that you were mentioning previously?
I think, of course, legislation would be essential. And then I think that if legislation doesn't come up soon, I think there has to be a change of behavior on how the procurement takes place in all the ports. And that would be a private decision of each port of what they want to do in terms of making sure that the ports are secure and that they're safe. So, to me, it's more of a, if taking long to pass legislation in the United States and other countries, I think it's a matter of, the maritime community to put together a policies and procedures that safeguards the ports and start implementing standards that just makes the operation safer and that prevent crimes, and also prevent the intervention of technology that could potentially expose trade. And the worst part, which is I think it's my biggest fear, is the capacity that some of these technology have to remotely shut down a port, and which would be a crisis.
So moving to you, Erik, so change in procurement at the port level, implementing standards, complementary standards, maybe there's an opportunity for getting different port operators together, look at what are some of the best practices, and maybe Carlos can share some of that with regard to transparency standards. Erik, what else would you add to that?
Yeah, so I'll try and be brief because I know we're time constrained. We've spent a lot of time talking about China. Our panel is on infrastructure and national security, right? And so the biggest infrastructure provider in the world, and sadly the biggest threat to national security, is one place, and it's China. I know I went off on a tangent on the AIS spoofing, but it's happening in our hemisphere as well. The biggest problem with AIS spoofers in the world by number of vessels are the Chinese illegal fishing fleet that you see off the coast of Peru, off Argentina. The biggest threat we see to our ports is China. The biggest threat we see to our supply chains, including our own military supply chains, is that the 25th supplier subcontractor that makes F-35s could be a Chinese company. We can't talk about infrastructure without electricity. Something like 65% of our large electricity transformers globally are made by China that have kill switches, including in our own country. And I know this sounds very, catastrophizing and very depressing, but my only point is to say, just be wary of what's going on. And there is a solution. The solution is for the countries, the people that represent the various countries in this room and others, to know what their supply chain looks like, where it's coming from. To Carlos's, very astute point on, knowing your supplier, knowing the cyber risk, and not going with the highest price point, or the lowest price point, I think is going to be very important going forward.
Well, sometimes maybe the lowest price point can actually be a very high price point in the end. Carlos, we have 2 minutes here. Last thoughts you want to leave with the audience on what key aspects, based on your experience in the Republic, can be actions that can be taken to improve port security?
Sí, bueno, pienso que estandarizar bienes, servicios, tener claridad con quién contratamos, con quién no, establecer pliego de condiciones que establezcan requisitos o requerimientos de adjudicación que no lleven a una continuidad y a una especie de proveedor único ficticio. Hay que prestar atención a las donaciones, muy común en países de la región. Nosotros recientemente emitimos una circular prohibiendo de manera expresa las donaciones, porque las donaciones parecieran ser que es un gesto de buena voluntad, pero detrás de esas donaciones hay un proveedor único que puede perpetuarse en el tiempo en servicios esenciales para el Estado. Creo que los estados deben desarrollar en algún momento industria de bienes estratégicos cuando puedan, para evitar desabastecimiento y garantizar suministro sensible. Reitero el tema de la soberanía tecnológica. Sistemas sensibles del Estado no pueden estar en manos de terceros. Sí. Y eso implica cualquier sistema de puertos, aeropuertos, fronteras, o sistemas que garanticen la seguridad nacional o la seguridad ciudadana. Por ejemplo, muy breve.
Yo voy a, dado que estamos como tenemos que terminar el panel. We have about, I think about a minute, 1 minute to wrap up. So I want to make sure I get to Carlene for a last
No, muy breve. Voy a poner un ejemplo de lo que es un sistema en manos no confiables. En la República Dominicana, investigamos un caso de corrupción, anulamos un contrato, enviamos a la justicia a quienes habían cometido un conjunto de actos. Esa misma empresa administraba la red semafórica del Gran Santo Domingo y en el momento que eran perseguidos por la justicia, por los fiscales, apagaron todos los semáforos del Gran Santo Domingo. Por poner un ejemplo
Carlos, I'm
sencillo.
going to jump in here because we're out of time. But that's a very important example for the audience. Carleen, 30 seconds, just one thing that you haven't shared about that you think is important from Tropical's perspective with port security.
Oh, I think I mean, I mentioned it before, but investment is going to be the biggest thing for us going forward, and taking advantage of this window of opportunity where there's a pivot towards the Caribbean region by the U.S. government. How can we take advantage of that? And, you know, security is an integrated network, so continuing to leverage that as we move forward.
Yeah, I think we cannot lose the momentum that we are in right now with regard to U.S. focus on the Caribbean. I think a lot of important takeaways as part of this panel. Please join me in thanking Jorge, as well as Carlos, Carleen, Erik, and Leah. Back to you, Randy.